Welcome everybody to the VFR Route Planning Workshop. I'm Mike D, one of the flight instructors in our flight school. Here I'm going to talk about some theory, and there's going to be moments during the video I'm going to ask you to pause to actually work on some of the exercises yourself. And then after that, when you resume the video, I will give you the solution to the problem. So it'll be a little bit interactive. So what we're going to talk about today is the objectives, the materials you'll need in this workshop, some assumptions, and then when we're talking about route planning, we're going to look at airport information, how to determine obstacle avoidance and VFR cruising altitudes, some talk about the weather and VFR minimums, how to actually do route planning and some navigation considerations, and then also looking a little bit more real world, but still affects you in the simulator, aircraft performance and fuel considerations when doing VFR route planning. So today's objectives is you want to be able to create a safe VFR route, giving a departure and destination airport. So like what we do a lot of our group flights in the pilot club, we'll actually give you the little magenta line to fly. But in this, we want to get you a little bit more experienced where you're comfortable picking that route yourself. For the exercise in here, we're going to be using the airport's Kilo Papa India Echo to Kilo Oscar Charlie Foxtrot. This workshop will also give you a solid foundation of knowledge for IFR flight planning as well, which will becoming in a subsequent workshop. And you should be able to apply the theory in this presentation using the practical examples we're going to go through. So, some materials you'll need for this workshop. VFR sectional chart. They can obviously be electronic. Skyvector is a free one you could use. Navigraph or 4Flight are paid subscriptions. The FAA chart supplements, which you can access through Skyvector and Navigraph as well, I believe. In this video series, I'm going to use Skyvector because it's free and also gives the FAA chart supplements. A source of weather information, which again could be Skyvector, and I'm actually going to show an alternative way to get weather through 1-800-WEATHER BRIEF. And then some optional tools if you'd like to do more real-world style planning is a Navlog, an E6B flight computer, winds aloft forecast, which you can get from the weather information, a copy of your pilot operating handbook for your aircraft of choice, and then obviously a weight and balance sheet to do weight and balance calculations. So some assumptions going into this workshop is that you have a basic understanding of your aircraft functionality. So I'm not going to be discussing how to do specific functions, like startup or something with your aircraft. A basic understanding of the difference between VFR and IFR. A really quick, in a nutshell, difference is VFR is visual flight rules, meaning you should be able to look out of the cockpit and have some decent visibility to make out some references either to the ground or around you, where IFR is instrument flight rules, where you're flying in conditions where there'll be limited or severely limited visibility, such as flying through the clouds or flying through bad weather. So again, we're doing VFR route planning in this workshop. Again, some other assumptions is that you understand basic ATC communications. I'm not really going to be covering that here. Some basic VFR sectional familiarity. So I'll go through some of the symbols on the VFR sectional chart, but just want to hope this isn't your first time looking at a VFR sectional. Some basic weather theory, I'm assuming you know. Again, we could go into a little bit, but just assuming you know some basics about clouds and weather. And for this workshop is focusing primarily on doing route planning for fixed wing aircraft, although some of it will be, or most of it will be applicable to helicopter route planning as well. So the first thing that we want to take a look at when we're doing our route planning, we can start with our departure and destination airports, and we want to get some information about the actual airport itself, right? We want to know what type of airspace is the airport in, its hours of operation, meaning this is a little bit more real world. Sometimes a tower will only be in operation for a certain period of time. If it's not in operation, then that airport goes is technically an uncontrolled airport. Runway lengths, runway type, right? Are we landing on asphalt, or is there like gravel or kind of unimproved surfaces that would affect, our takeoffs and landings? So we definitely want to know that information. If we're doing VFR at night or even during the daytime, airport lighting and runway lighting can help you. So if there's a PAPI available, things like that, we want to know that information as well. And if there's any special procedures at the airport, Maisie, there's specific hazards. I live up here in the Northeast. There's always deer running around, lots of trees. Maybe there's some trees, at the end of the runway that you want to be careful of. And also to their, some airports might have noise abatement procedures that they might ask you to fly a, specific heading away from the airport so you don't go over a town and drive all the residents crazy with the noise. So all of this info can be found on the VFR sectional chart, and I'm going to show that now. So if I go to Skyvector, www.skyvector.com, and then there, what you can do if you haven't used it before, you can click on Flight Plan, and you could put in your departure and destination airport codes. And then what will happen is you'll get a hyperlink that appears for each of your airports. So for here, my first one is St. Peter's Clearwater International. If I click on that, what's going to happen is I'm going to get this screen where I'll get a lot of information about the airport and about its runways and the like. So what I'm going to actually look at is the chart supplement. So if you hover over on your left-hand side and click the chart supplement, this is an FAA chart supplement that there's a lot of codes in here, but it becomes pretty intuitive when you read through it for the first time. So for instance, if I'm looking at the lighting at St. Petersburg Clearwater, I can look at some of the text description here to understand that lighting. And then also it'll be represented on the diagram here on the right. So if we're looking at some runway lighting here, we have PAPIs available on runway 18. It's a 4-light PAPI that's here in the code. The glide slope will be 3 degrees. Runway 36 also has a 4-light PAPI. There's also Mauser on runway 18, which is basically this big long trail of lights, and I can bring up a diagram of it. Big long trail of lights that kind of guide you right into the runway here. So the Mauser lighting is this strip of lights. They can come in several different configurations, but basically these strips of lights that basically walks you right into the runway at night, very clear to see. This is some Mauser lighting here on the right-hand side. Some other lighting we might have here is HIRL, which is high intensity runway lighting. So that's going to be the lighting on both sides of the runway along the edges. So that'll be very bright and very light. On runways 4 and 22, we have REILs, REILs, and I can show a diagram of what those are. And that's runway edge lighting. And then basically they're going to be the flashing lights. Sorry, this is not the best diagram. The REILs are going to be the flashing lights on the end of the runway. So here, where this red circle is, that flashing strobe light is basically your REIL that's flashing at the edge to let you know that's the end of the runway. Some other information we can get about the runways as well is what they're made out of. So runway 18 and 36 are asphalt. So that'll be there in the code. Some of this we're not going to get into, but there is a way to decode the chart supplement. There's a legend if you're interested in what all of this is. This has to do with different grades and weights that the runway can handle, but we're not going to go into that here. You can also notice if there's any obstructions or anything to be concerned about. So on runway 4 and 22, in runway 4, it'll notice that it says trees. So if we look at runway 4 and look at our diagram, we're also going to see some pictures of trees over here. The other information that we could get here, like I spoke about before, there's some noise abatement procedures. So they're telling us there's a noise sensitive area 5 miles north, extending 1 mile east and west to the shoreline. And then they're asking us if we take off from runway 36 to actually use published noise abatement procedures. The airport is also attended continuously, meaning the tower is always open. So it should always stick to the airspace that it is, which we'll check in a second. It says that there's birds in the area, which could be important for obstructions. So you definitely want to read all of these comments. It'll give you all of the communication frequencies. Your ATIS is available here, what your common traffic advisory frequency is, how to get weather. This is a Class D airport, and then it'll tell you this is what I was speaking of before, right? It's between 1100 and 0400 Zulu. This airport is Class Delta, but other times it actually functions as a Class Echo airspace. So you want to be cognizant of that. And then the other things we want to be careful of too is the VOR. If we're using radio navigation, it's unstable. It's at certain degrees and certain nautical miles beyond the airport, below certain altitudes. So again, a little bit more real world, but it could affect you in the simulator as well in terms of what the VOR usability is, if that's modeled. So at this point, this should give you a good familiarity with the airport. The one major thing we also want to know, depending on what kind of aircraft you're using, is what is the longest runway that's available, right? If I'm using a little Cessna, that's going to give me, I have, different runway length considerations versus using a TBM or something, or high performance aircraft, which might require a longer runway. So in this case, if we look, our longest runway here is 9,730 feet long over here where my mouse is, and the airport is actually, the runway is actually 150 feet wide. So our longest runway is 9,730 feet. That information can also be found on the actual sectional view of the chart. So if I go here to St. Petersburg, where my mouse is, this 97, they cut off the last two zeros, so this actually means 9,700 feet, which is the length of the longest runway. The airport is 11 feet MSL above sea level is the elevation. Your ATIS information is here. The frequency is 134.5, and control tower is 118.3. And then you can notice it's actually this airport. Some people got confused. This airport actually is a Class Delta because of the dash blue line. But if we're doing route planning, we actually want to be very aware of this Class Bravo airspace of Tampa International, which is kind of around, and we'll discuss this in a minute. We have to be very cognizant of this if we're taking off from St. Peter's Clearwater and heading up to the northeast. So we covered airport type, hours of operation, runway length, runway type, airport lighting. So at this point, what I would suggest is pause the video and take a look at Ocala International Jim Taylor Field, which is our destination airport, all the way up here to the northeast. Pause the video, take a look at the chart supplement, and answer the following questions here about, or the following information points here about Ocala Airport. And then when you resume the video, I will actually give you the answers. So pause that now. Okay, going back from your pause, if you look at Ocala Airport, right, we can look at this diagram as well, which kind of gives a whole layout of the airport, gives you your frequencies up here, and also gives you a graphical representation of where everything's laid out. So it's pretty obvious from this one, your longest runway is 9,467 feet long. So again, for a Cessna 172, that's more than sufficient to do a landing. If we were doing, let's say, a night VFR flight, we'd want to see what type of lighting is available. And also we want to know what kind of runway at any day or night, what kind of runway surface is available. So this is asphalt for runways 18 to 36. Also for runway 18 to 36, we see 36 has the Mauser lighting here. So Mauser lighting is going to be down over here by runway 36. Our PAPI is going to be off to the left. That's denoted by the P with the circle around it. Our longest runway length we talked about here, 7,467 by 150 wide. Some things we want to be careful of. Runway 36 has a displaced threshold. So I'll draw that with a circle. That's this symbol right here, kind of like that infinity symbol. They're also telling us there's some trees that we need to be aware of. That's all these little drawings of trees here. What else is relevant? High intensity runway lighting. So these should be very bright lights that we should see on the edge of the runway. And that seems about it in terms of important information. Again, look at the airport remarks. So hopefully you took a look at seeing when the airport was attended, right? What kind of airspace it's in. So again, it's Class Delta airspace only from 1200 to 0100 Zulu. At all other times, it's treated as a Class Echo airspace. And in terms of the airport remarks, runway 36 usually has winds that are calm. So generally when they make airports, right, they try to get runways most aligned to the wind because we always want to take off and land into the wind. So when they actually made airport runways, they try to align them most, into the wind for that specific area as much as possible. There's some restrictions on aircraft's wingspans, right? So you have to be 60 feet or less on certain taxiways here. So Alpha 1 is restricted to aircraft with wingspans 60 feet or less. So again, these remarks are all pretty important. You'll have some leeway in the simulator, but again, if you were doing this a little bit more real life, all of this information you want to check in your flight planning before you actually, when you decide on your airports. So here we spoke about airport information and what's important to look at on the chart. So again, when we just did this from KPIE to KOCF, we looked at our airspace considerations. Actually, we're going to do that right now. We looked at our runway lengths, if it's sufficient for your aircraft, and what special procedures. So in terms of knowing your airspace, what we need to be careful of here is that Class Bravo going out of St. Petersburg here. So take a minute. If you were going to fly this northeast flight plan to go direct between St. Pete's, Clearwater, and Ocala, what kind of considerations do we have with the Class Bravo airspace? Take a second, pause the video, and look at the different Bravo shelves that we have here, and look at some of your airspace considerations. All right, so if you're coming back, so this Bravo shelf starts at 1,200 and goes up to 10,000 feet. So if I'm taking off from St. Pete Clearwater and just taking this direct route, basically I cannot go above 1,200, otherwise I'd be in the Bravo airspace, which would require me to get explicit clearance to be in the Bravo. So if I'm not comfortable with that, in terms of, what's my altitude that I want to fly, let's say I want to fly higher than 1,200 feet, to be a little bit more comfortable than that, I might adjust my flight plan actually to come out over here to the west, right? You can just do this in Skyvector, drag the line and hit plan. I might actually want to fly out to the west to be in this Bravo, underneath this Bravo shelf, which starts at 6,000, and maybe I'd go here and kind of go up the coastline a little bit until I get out of this Bravo. So that's a possibility to do it that way. Again, all depends on your minimums, and we're going to talk about how to choose the appropriate altitude in a little bit for your flight. But definitely this, and I picked this airport purposely because of this, you definitely want to look at this Bravo airspace and all the different shelves that are within the Bravo airspace. because that will have an impact on your flight plan. So let's talk about obstacle avoidance. The two main things that you want to do when you're flying your aircraft is we don't want to crash into anything, and we want to know where we are. And crashing into things, I mean crashing into terrain or any man-made obstructions. So on the sectional chart, what they give you, which is really nice, is on the VFR sectional, where the latitude and longitude lines intersect and kind of make a rectangle, like boxes or rectangles, there's going to be a maximum elevation figure, MEF. And that's going to be here in this large blue number and smaller number. So the way to read this is the large number is thousands and the little number is hundreds. So this would be 2,600. And the way that they arrive at this is there's a little bit of a formula. Basically, we're going to look at the highest obstruction that's within that rectangle that is caused by the latitude and longitude intersecting. So what they do is they take the highest obstruction, and we're going to use this highest obstruction, which is 2,298 MSL. They add 100 feet for vertical error, and then they also add 200 feet for your vertical obstruction allowance, meaning you're going to clear that obstruction at least by 200 feet, and then they take that number and round it up to the next 100 feet. So in this case, it's 2298. Add 100 for vertical error is 2398. Add another 200 for vertical obstacle clearance is 2598. And then round it up to the next 100 feet is 2600. And that's where that big 2 and 6 come from. So that figure is going to be all along those rectangular boxes, all along our sectional chart. So if we took the more direct route to the northeast, right, and we have this Bravo shelf at 1200, we want to look at our MEF figure to make sure that we're going to clear any obstacles that are within this shelf over here. So if we look, we want to look for our MEF. Our MEF actually is 1,700, right? Or actually, yes, 1,700. So somewhere in here, there's a pretty high obstruction. So if we're flying at 1,200 feet, we want to look and make sure we're not going to actually crash into that obstruction along our flight path. And those obstructions are actually these little symbols here. I call them carets, right? The first figure is the obstruction height in MSL, and then the other one in here is the height in AGL. So you want to take a look at your flight plan and make sure that you're not going to, that's not going to be a problem with that obstruction height if you're going to fly at 1200, because they're telling us the 1700 is the safe altitude to fly at. That's why it might be preferable, actually, just for safety, and if you have your personal minimums, maybe to come out to the west here underneath this Bravo shelf that starts at 6,000. And if we're flying, higher, we're definitely, going to be guaranteed obstacle clearance if we do that. And it looks like that highest obstacle is probably this one here, this big lit tower with the flashing light at 1,544. So most likely this is our highest obstruction here within that. So we want to be cognizant of that when we're flying. So that is called the maximum elevation figure, and it's on every rectangle in the VFR sectional chart. And this is what I spoke about before. If you don't know how to find the legend on what all of these symbols mean in Skyvector, if you're at St. Pete Clearwater International, just zoom in, look at, let's say, the Tampa TAC, and then scroll out. And this is actually what a real world sectional chart looks like. And in the top left-hand corner, there is going to be a legend that basically describes everything that I spoke about, all the different symbols and figures and what they stand for. So if we scroll down to the obstructions symbols, we can take a look what all of these different symbols mean for obstructions. There's one for a wind turbine. There's one symbols for a group of obstructions. And then these obstructions themselves actually, based on height, look different. So one that's 1,000 and higher AGL is going to be like this longer symbol, whereas ones that are between 200 and 1000 are the shorter symbol. And then if the obstruction has any high intensity lighting is lit, is going to have this kind of lightning bolt symbols radiating from them. So there's a lot of information that you can gather from there as well. So obstacle avoidance, we want to be careful. What's the height of the obstructions along our flight path, and we have to make sure we're not going to hit them and have clearance. And the way to do that is that the MEF figure is the easiest and quickest way to do it, because you don't want to sit here and look at every single obstruction along your flight path. You just kind of look at that number. So in this rectangle here, right, along our flight path, the MEF is only 900 feet. So if we're flying, let's say, at 2,500 feet, we're definitely going to be avoiding any obstructions within that. So take a moment to pause, take a look, and figure out what would your safe altitude and obstructions that you'd have to pay attention to KPIE, to KOCF. Another thing to look at is what is your navigation aids and Victor Airways potentially that are available. So Victor Airways, for anybody who doesn't know, are generated by the VORs, right? So there is a VOR here, or excuse me, a VORTAC at St. Petersburg. So if you want to tune to that one, you would put in 116.4 in your nav radio. If you're using like a glass cockpit, the identifier should come up, PIE. If you're not using a glass cockpit, you should hear the Morse code identifier here to make sure that you're directly tuned in or correctly tuned into the VOR. And then what happens is there's these things called radials. They're like spokes radiating out from like a bicycle tire, if you think of it that way, right? You have spokes in the middle. And there's a Victor Airway. In this case, if I fly the 016 radial going out of St. Pete, that's actually the Victor 441 airway. So the airway is kind of like a highway in the sky. So if I wanted to fly that, right, I can fly the Victor 441 airway kind of this way and use that to navigate. And then as I get a little closer, maybe I switch over to the Ocala VOR or VORTAC, and then I can use the Ocala VORTAC to kind of continue to fly into Ocala field. So you can remember, you always want to have multiple ways of using navigation, right? So don't rely just on GPS, but if I use GPS, I tune into a VOR potentially, and I'm looking outside the cockpit, and I can know, where I am by looking at symbols on the map, in relation, or to my sectional relation to what's outside the cockpit. Now I have, 3 different ways that I'm navigating. There's literally no way you could get lost if you do that. So take a look at some nav aids, look at your Victor Airways, and see what is available on your route of flight. Now talk about cruising altitudes, right? What altitude do you pick along this route of flight? So only if you're above 3,000 AGL do you have to fly basically these specific headings or at specific altitudes when you're flying a magnetic course. Okay, not what's on your compass, the course, which is basically the track that your aircraft is flying. So if you're flying VFR and your magnetic track is between 0 and 179, you want to fly odd altitudes plus 500, odd thousands plus 500. So for example, this would be like 3,500, 5,500, etc. If you're flying 359 to 180, you fly evens plus 500, even thousands plus 500. So that'd be 4,500, 6,500. Just to give you the rationale of why this is done this way, when people fly IFR, they fly odd thousands, right? So for 0 to 179, they're just flying odd thousands, like 5,000. So if you're flying VFR at 5,500 and there's an IFR aircraft flying at 5,000, you're guaranteed at least 500 feet of separation between you and the IFR aircraft. And again, this only applies if you're above 3,000 feet AGL. So going back to our example, maybe pause the video and pick which appropriate altitude based on whatever flight plan you came up with If you're flying, let's say, Victor 441 airway, right? That's kind of a northeastern track at 016 degrees. So we want to fly odds plus 500s, right? So if I'm that's only when you're above 3,000 feet AGL. So if I was flying this route here, I can't go above 1,200 here because this is the Bravo shelf. So maybe when I get out of this Bravo shelf, right, I can still climb a little bit more, but I'm still going to be below 3,000 feet. Maybe when I get out of that Bravo shelf over here, I might want to climb up to 3,500 feet if I want to do some sightseeing close to the ground. If I take this route over here, right, and did this a little bit over here, you fly the altitude for the leg that you're flying, not for the whole flight plan. So this one, I'm actually flying a westerly heading, right? So if I go above 3,000 AGL on this westerly heading, I need to be evens plus 500. And then when I switch over to my 030 track, I need to be odds plus 500. So it's always for whatever leg of the trip that you're flying, that's the altitude you need to be at for that leg here. Okay, and that's again only for above 3,000 feet AGL. If you're going really close to the ground, let's say like in a helicopter or something, or even in a fixed wing aircraft, if you're below 3,000 feet AGL, you don't need to fly those VFR altitudes here in the chart. So it only applies above 3,000 feet AGL. So again, take a moment to pause. What altitude would you fly from KPIE to KCOF? So take a look at that. And again, that's going to change depending on which flight plan you choose or what flight path. So you might say, okay, what is the correct flight path? The correct flight path really is up to you as long as you can accomplish a couple things. Avoid obstacles and also use and also know where you are at all times, right? So if you're going to use that VOR and use Victor 441 airway and you want to fly this and it's within your personal minimums to fly, below 1,200 feet for part of your flight, that's totally fine. If it's not in your personal minimums or you don't feel comfortable doing that, again, maybe you want to pop out here, to the west a little bit, and then if you wanted to, you could kind of follow the coastline, right? Because that should be very easy to be able to fly right up the coastline. The other thing you want to be careful of too, there's a lot of good information here on the sectional chart, right? So if you're remember, VFR is visual. You can see outside the cockpit. You should be able to see stuff on the ground. So, if you want to take another approach to this, maybe you just want to track a certain highway or something along your route of flight. So you want to make sure you can pick out very noticeable things from, that you'll see from altitude, that you could be able to look outside the cockpit, look at your chart, and the two correspond. That's called pilotage, where you can look outside or look at your sectional, look outside, and you can match the two up. So you'll notice here there's some very prominent intersections here with Highway 19. I could definitely use that here to notice, to know where I'm at. There's a big airport over here. If you're tracking along the shoreline, there's these things called VFR reporting points. They look like a little golf flag. So ATC would know if you call in and say, I'm near Newport Richey, which is the name of this VFR reporting point, ATC, the tower, would know exactly where you are because both them and you would know where that reporting point is. You want to look for maybe lakes or rivers or something that have a very distinct shape or feature. These might be a little bit hard to make out, like which one is exactly like north or south, but you should have a huge series of lakes if you ended up taking your flight path a little bit more this way. So if you want to, especially at night, major highways that have a lot of traffic are going to be very well lit. So that's good to track a highway if you're doing a night VFR flight. Also on your sectional chart, all of this yellow shading means populated areas with a lot of lighting, right? So if you're doing a night VFR flight, the ocean is obviously going to be very dark. And if you're tracking the coastline, you should be able to see this well-lit area in yellow. And then, maybe a point I want to look out for are these really tall lit obstructions over here. lakes and rivers and things, and those types of things are going to be very difficult to see at night. So it's going to be very hard to notice those things at night. It's just all going to blend together. So there are VFR weather minimums. So there's a little bit, you can Google a little bit of a cheat sheet. Basically, the first number here, when you look at a specific airspace, so if we say class Delta, the first number here, the 3, is the amount of miles and minimum miles you need of visibility. So for VFR, you need at least 3 statute miles of visibility for class Delta airspace. And then the 152s means 1,000 feet above clouds, 500 feet below, or 2,000 feet and 2,000 feet horizontally away from the clouds. Those are your weather minimums, right? You can't fly through the clouds in VFR. So you have to adhere to these different weather minima when you're doing your VFR route planning. So take a look and pause the video. Does your weather between KPIE and KOCF meet weather minimums today for a day VFR flight? And then also maybe take a look at it as if you were doing a night VFR flight. And you also want to answer the question why or why not. In Skyvector, if you want to get the METARs for each of the different airports, you can click on this tab that says layers and then check the box that says text weather. And then anything that's in green, right, you'll get the METAR if you hover over it. And green means that it's VFR weather. Whereas if the box is red, or excuse me, the circle is red, like the one I'm looking at right now for North Palm Beach County, right, that's below VFR minimums. When the circle's in red, this only has 2.5 statute miles of visibility, and it's raining with a scattered cloud layer of 3,000. So red is below VFR minimum. Blue circles are going to be marginal VFR weather here. And then greens are going to be VFR weather. You can also, on Skyvector as well, there's different overlays that you can click on for weather radar, if there's any icing or turbulence conditions. So there's all kinds of different, you can get your SIGMETs as well. If there's IFR rules, right, you can click on all these different layers and kind of get that information if you're using a free charting tool like Skyvector. So we talked about our airports. We talked about weather minimum. We also talked about what altitudes you need to fly and how not to crash into obstructions, right? So how do we actually, again, if we want to do the pilotage, looking outside the aircraft and corresponding to the map, there's some techniques that you could use to do this. One of them is pretty easy to do in the simulator. It's called pilotage. And then dead reckoning, I'll kind of introduce what that looks like in real life, and then also if you're using our flight school. So what we want to do when we do our VFR route planning is we want to pick waypoints that are about 10 nautical miles, 10 to 15 nautical miles at most, away from each other. And again, these are things that are very noticeable from altitude. So they would be things like highways or uniquely shaped land or lakes. There might be airports along our route. They could be those VFR reporting points or something like a wind farm. And then we have some considerations at night that you want a very well-lit area or, and maybe lit obstructions. So again, from KPIE to KOCF is our example, right? If I was going to take the initial route where I just use the Victor 441, which I can put in here. If I use the Victor 441 airway, I want to pick out things that are very noticeable, right? So you'll notice here, coming out of St. Pete Clearwater, you're going over water. There's a highway that goes over, a bridge that goes over the water, and then there's a power plant that's right here in this area. And if you want to plan that as a waypoint, just left click on it, hit plan, and then it'll set that as a waypoint, and it'll give you the magnetic heading and distance. So that one's about 6 nautical miles away. So when I take off from St. Pete Clearwater, right, I want to make sure I'm on track. So I know I should overfly that power plant. The other way you can look at this, if you don't have like ForeFlight, because I believe ForeFlight integrates a satellite view in their product, is you could just go to Google Maps, and in this case, I can just throw in KPIE Airport, click on my maps, and then click on my satellite layer, right? So this is KPIE, where we're taking off, St. Pete Clearwater Airport. And if I know from altitude, right, I'm flying over, there's that highway that I would pass over, right? That bridge and highway that I'd pass over that goes over the water. And here's that little peninsula with the power plant right here. So again, if I'm flying this, as I zoom out, this would be very, very noticeable from altitude, right? So that would be a great VFR point that you want to pick. So kind of going along with that, right? If I zoom out a little bit, you can see Lake Tarpon over here is uniquely shaped. If you ended up going more to the west, that could be another area that you could use as like a VFR waypoint. Moon Lakes, right? It's pretty prominent that these two lakes are kind of, together here. You can even follow Highway 589 up there as well. So, tracking right up 589 could be another way to do this as well. So take a look at your sectional chart. Another one they gave us is the Odessa VFR reporting point. That's pretty noticeable, and that's about 12 nautical miles away from my power plant. And again, along my Victor 441 route, so I'll pick that as another waypoint. Another waypoint you could pick right here, if I'm staying along Victor 441, is going to be the Brooksville Airport. That's going to be very noticeable. And again, you don't have to directly fly over the waypoint, but just enough where you would see it. And that is about, all right, a little bit, it's pushing a little bit, but it's 18 nautical miles away. And again, I can know that I'm going to, be tracking, I could need to stay between the ocean and this highway, these two highways over here. So I can kind of, keep myself aligned between those two highways. If I'm continuing up Victor 441 over here, right, you're going to have some very noticeable highways over here, Highway 19. I'm kind of staying in between these two highways over here. So that would be a great part of the route. And then maybe my next waypoint could be, again, pushing it up a little bit, these two airports, right? So I need to fly in between Crystal River, which should be off to my left, Iverness, which is off to my right. And I should notice that there's a lot of lakes over the right-hand side. If I'm continuing on, if I pick this waypoint here, continue on Victor 441, maybe another waypoint could be these power lines, right? So that's about 11 nautical miles. So I should cross over a series of power lines. And then there should be these huge lakes right in front of me. So that should be pretty noticeable. And then if I'm going to pick one more, here I can kind of track this highway a little bit, going close to Ocala as well. So again, pick very noticeable things from altitude. If you need to double check it, take a look maybe on like Google Maps, right? You see Highway 19 over here. So staying in between these two highways would be very, very simple and very easy to see from altitude. Some of these major intersections are going to be very noticeable from altitude. If you're flying like in the Midwest, they have those like kind of crop circles that they make. Some of them might be very prominent. Big towns, if there's a bunch of nothing and all of a sudden there's a big town that you would see, that could be another waypoint as well. And the way this is used in a little bit more in real life, if you were doing your private pilot license, or if you take our flight school and do our PPL, is that you would actually have a thing called the nav log. So you would have all those checkpoints or waypoints along. So here we have KPIE to the power plant. You would fill in what altitude you would be at. You'd have some information here, which will be discussed in a future workshop, how to correct for the wind, right? So the wind doesn't push you off course. So you ultimately come up with what compass heading you should fly, how long that leg is. So from KPIE to power plant, we said it was about 6 to 8 nautical miles. And if I was going a certain speed, this estimated time en route how long do I estimate it would actually take me to get from KPIE to the power plant? And you would actually use like a stopwatch or a chronometer in your aircraft. And around the 6 minute mark, give or take a little bit, I should expect to see that power plant. If I don't, I'm probably way off course or something's way wrong if I can't see that, within the 6 minutes. So take a look. Again, this is not the only answer of how to do this. There's other ways. Again, if you're taking that route to the west, you would probably have completely different waypoints. So there's no quote unquote right answer. The only wrong answer is just something that's either not safe or not very noticeable. So if you wanted to take this route a little bit more to the west, we could use Clearwater Beach as a reporting point or as a waypoint, right? Because that's a VFR reporting point. Tarpon Springs, right? We know that lake is going to be very prominent. So that could be, another waypoint right there, which satisfies our distance requirement. Yep, it's about 10 nautical miles away. If we keep going up along the coast, we had these lit obstructions here. So these really long, really large obstructions, tall, and Tarpon Springs Lake over here should be extremely noticeable. So that's a great waypoint. So yeah, you can track kind of this highway up here as well, right? Highway 19. So you should track between the shoreline and Highway 19. So those are kind of the techniques that you would use. You probably could, if you want to stay along the shoreline, you could probably do this. You might be able to see Brooksville Airport, depending on your altitude. And again, that would be, well, that's a little far. So you'd have to pick another waypoint somewhere in here. So yeah, so take a look and try to pick some waypoints. Again, about 10 nautical miles away from each other, 10 to 15, and something very noticeable from altitude. Some other considerations when you're doing VFR route planning. You do not need to file a flight plan. On VATSIM or in real life, VFR flight does not require a flight plan, and it does not require any alternate airport to be provided. Some fuel requirements. You want to be able to hit your destination airport plus an additional 30 minutes of fuel for day VFR. If you're flying at night, the requirements will be enough fuel for your destination plus an additional 45 minutes at night. So yeah, so again, pick your waypoints, kind of mentally ask yourself, why did I pick that waypoint? Is it very noticeable? Would I use the same route that I picked for a day VFR flight during the night? Chances are maybe not. And you would pick actually different waypoints for a night VFR flight. And like I said, you would fill out a flight log, which would have those waypoints, what ultimately correcting for the wind. It'll give you what compass heading you should fly and how much distance between each waypoint there is. That's called leg distance. You would actually calculate your ground speed and how long it would take you to fly that leg. And then at the end of it, you're going to get a total for your flight time. In this case, for the waypoints I picked, this would be a total flight time of 42 minutes with a total distance of 80 nautical miles. Then we would do fuel calculations, right? How much fuel do I need to have on board to safely fly this, meeting also my minimum reserves. And then you would fill out all kinds of airport information, like the runway lengths that we talked about before, and all my frequencies. And then we would also take some weather information here for our departure, en route weather, and destination, right? To make sure that we have no clouds or freezing, conditions. We also want our winds aloft forecast. And then we would actually also calculate weight and balance here as well to get our landing and takeoff performance as well. So basically, this would be a physical thing you would print out, 1 or 2 pages, put it on your knee board in real life, and then you can always reference it instead of having to constantly switch over maybe to the chart or sectional every 5 seconds, or all your basic information is right here that you would need, or important information that you would need. So there are some aircraft performance considerations. So in real life, right, we're all flying in the simulator, but in a real airplane, there's no reset button. So I actually found this video that's actually kind of scary and crazy about somebody who actually did kind of cut it close on his calculations, and then you'll see the result in a minute.
use up every possible inch of runway available.
I recently saw this footage for the first time and it scared the hell out of me. It's actually like 4 years old and it made the rounds going viral in the aviation community back then. And I wondered, how could I have missed this? And then I realized it was because I had one of these around that time, so I was a little bit distracted from flying. But after things settled down in my life, I got back into it. So anyway, seeing this video actually inspired me to think about my personal minimums. Adding a margin to weather minimums is kind of an obvious one, but it's really important to think about margins with performance calculations as well.
Let me get my mojo. Alrighty.
So Chris Palmer from Angle of Attack was kind enough to share this footage with me so I could revive it and put a flight shop spin on it. The basic spin is, it's a high performance airplane, a turbo Bonanza I believe. He's taken off from a very short runway, surrounded by trees at a high density altitude.
Alright, so let's do it.
Chris does an amazing job analyzing exactly what happens here, so I'm not going to get into those kind of details, but I'm going to provide links that you have to check out. For now, what I want to simply do is watch and react to it.
Airspeed is alive. Backed. Engine's in the green. Backed.
So clearly Chris knows he's facing a bit of a challenge as he starts this takeoff roll. But he knows his airplane, and he did his math, and he knows the numbers say it can be done, but the question is, will it be done? So after rotation here, he's committed, and you can see things aren't going as planned.
That's just a little scary. Little. Oh boy. Wow. Okay, things we are not doing again.
So that couldn't have been any closer. Let's just back it up and check this out. Look at those treetops. I mean, the wingtips are definitely below those. So he just squeaked it through that gap. He managed to instinctually turn just slightly left there to find that one gap that he had, and he made it through. And he fought the urge to pull back, which I think a lot of people would have done, and then he would have mushed into those trees for sure. So kudos for flying right on the edge, man. He got it out.
So important things about performance that we want to talk about here. So first of all, if anybody was curious, this is the displaced threshold. And displaced threshold means you can take off within the displaced area, but if he was actually coming in for a landing, he'd want to land ahead of this white line, ahead of these caret symbols. But at the beginning of the video, there was a little bit of background information that was important here, if I can find it. It was that this was a short field takeoff, and that also it was in a high density altitude situation. So high density altitude means altitude that's corrected for non-standard temperature, right? So in the case of this high density altitude, this day might have been higher or hotter than standard. So what happens then is the air molecules spread out more at a higher temperature, which means there's less air going over the wings and through the propeller, which means your aircraft is actually going to act or perform as if it was at a higher altitude. So if you were at sea level, let's say, and you had a really hot day in Florida, your aircraft at a high density altitude might actually be performing as if you were at 3,000 feet instead of at sea level. Why that's important, obviously, is you're going to get less performance. And that's what happened to this pilot here. Flying in a high density altitude situation, he was not getting the performance that he was expecting from his aircraft, even though he did some calculations to take that into account. And he was doing a short field takeoff. So this could affect you in the simulator. And the way to make sure you don't end up like this pilot and really cut it close or end up crashing into the trees is you want to take a look at your pilot operating handbook. So every aircraft comes with a pilot operating handbook in real life. They're generally laid out the same way. They're going to give you a bunch of performance specifications, on the first page, which will give you, your rate of climb at sea level, your service ceiling, which is, how high the aircraft can fly. So this one I'm looking at is for a Cessna 172 G1000. So I can't do a flight, up at 18,000 feet with this aircraft because the service ceiling is only 14,000 feet. And they'll give you some takeoff performance numbers, right? So if I'm doing, again, at standard conditions, I need 960 feet of ground roll to do my takeoff. And if I had an obstacle that was 50 feet, I would need 1,630 feet of ground roll to be able to clear that obstacle. It also gives you your stall speed. So to not end up like this pilot, right? What you would do is actually there's a performance section, Section 5, right? Which is going to give you all sorts of performance calculations that, you could do in your aircraft to make sure that you're getting the performance in those situations you need. And then again, I would always add a little bit more of a buffer. Don't just go by the numbers here. So there's a lot of charts. If you scroll through your charts, you're going to notice there's a short field takeoff distance, and they're going to have it at different, different weights. Potentially maybe 2,100 pounds, and then another one at 2,500. And the way to read this chart is you always want to read the conditions. So this is telling me if I'm in flaps 10 degrees, condition, I have to apply full throttle before I release my parking brake, and I'm on a paved, level, dry runway in a zero wind condition, and I'm rotating at 51 knots. This is going to tell me what ground roll I'm going to need, and also the ground roll if I want to clear a 50-foot obstacle. Now you notice across the top, there's different temperature configurations, and across the left-hand side, there's different pressure altitude, which just basically means what is your altimeter reading. So if I'm at an airport at sea level in Florida, and it's a cold day outside, let's say 10 degrees Celsius, I only need 920 feet of ground roll. But you'll notice as we get higher in density altitude, right, the temperature gets higher, I actually need a lot more ground roll to be able to do that same length of runway. And of course, the higher I go above sea level and the hotter the temperature goes, I'm actually going to need even more ground roll, right? So maybe at 0 degrees at 5,000 feet altitude, I only need 1355. But for pressure altitude of 5,000 feet at 40 degrees Celsius, I'm going to need 1,825 feet. And there's additional notes that you always want to take into consideration too, right? This is telling me that if I'm operating on a grass runway, I need to add 15% to each of those ground roll figures, right? So I'd have to take the ground roll here and add an additional 15%. If there's winds coming out of a certain direction, like if I have a headwind, right, I can decrease my distances by 10% because I'm getting more performance. So you always want to read the notes and read the conditions and always take them into account. But there is a short field takeoff distance chart in the POH, and there's also going to be a short field landing chart as well that will be found in the performance section, which I skipped over somehow. My apologies. But there will be a short field landing, here we go, at a different weight configurations as well. So again, if you're landing at a shorter airport, maybe if you're doing more like bush flying and you want to, got a shorter length of runway and you don't, want to see if you're going to be able to land safely, then you want to use the short field landing calculations, right? Obviously, if you can do a short field landing, if you have a longer runway, then you should be able to clear that landing no problem as well. Other useful information in the POH is you're going to get cruise performance, right? So if you're trying to calculate your fuel burn and how much fuel you're going to need, for a pressure altitude here, again, pressure altitude is along the left-hand side, your RPM setting over here. So there's different configurations of RPM settings. And then what's the temperature? Is it standard, below standard, or above? And that there's a chart for what standard temperature is at certain altitudes. And then it'll give me my indicated airspeed and how many gallons per hour I'm going to burn. So if I'm here at a pressure altitude of 2,000 feet and I'm flying at 2550 RPM, which is basically almost full throttle in my Cessna 172, I can expect to go 117 as my indicated airspeed and burn almost 10 gallons per hour if my aircraft weighs 2,550 pounds and I'm leaning the aircraft correctly. So the POH, I don't think we use it enough on our flights and people don't reference it enough, but this performance section is definitely super important and you should take that into consideration when you're doing your flight planning. So we talked about density altitude. Also your weight and balance is going to definitely play into your performance of your aircraft as well. If your aircraft is not properly weighted, if you're overweighted, you might not even be able to take off at all, right? If in real life you put too much baggage or you're carrying too many passengers, more than you should, and you're above the weight limits, your aircraft might not be able to even take off on the ground. And again, I think that's something we take for granted in the simulator because it's pretty easy to hit the reset button and just adjust it on the fly. But in real life, you would definitely want to do your weight and balance calculations way before your flight to make sure um, if you fall into acceptable limits. And there will be a chart in the POH for weight and balance. Let me find that should be section, I believe 6. Yep. So if I go down to section 6 on my weight and balance, they'll give you some examples of how to actually calculate that weight and balance, right? How do I calculate weight of the aircraft? Using basic empty weight, usable fuel. And again, this will be another workshop that we go through. And then you're going to go through and make sure you're within your center of gravity limits. Basically, this chart here, as long as I'm within this area somewhere here and not outside these black lines, that means I should be okay to fly. So all this you want to use in your VFR route planning, right? If you're, expecting to climb or need to climb, a certain amount to clear an obstacle, that's really close to your takeoff airport, let's say, you want to make sure you're going to have that performance to actually do that, and to make sure that you're going to have a safe flight. So obviously, this is a recorded session, so there are no questions and answers. But if you do have any questions at all, or want to learn more, please sign up for our TPC flight school. It's a free flight school, right? All of this information is completely free in our flight school. So go up to thepilotclub.org, click on pilot training, TPC flight school. You can enroll. And if you're interested in doing it, we offer 2 ratings as of the time of this video. The PPL course, which is equivalent to like a real world course for a private pilot license. It's called P1 on VATSIM. You can take basically all the course you can enroll for free, and it consists of a bunch of self-paced modules, mostly videos. Then what you do eventually is you take a written exam, which is a multiple choice questions. Once you get past the written exam, you actually have live flights that you do with an instructor to do various flight maneuvers. And just like real life, you'll do a check ride with an instructor, and you pass the check ride, and you'll get your P1 rating on VATSIM. And if you do that as well, we also have the P2 course available, which is equivalent to a real world or similar to a real world instrument rating as well. So if there's any interest in doing that and you want to learn more, feel free to take the P1 course. And if you've passed it, then you can go on to your P2. I hope this session was educational for you. And again, I'm Mike D. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or any of our other flight instructors in our flight school that will be able to help you with any VFR route planning questions that you may have.